Hello, everyone. It's so great to welcome each of you here tonight. This is our fourth in the series, the Journeys to Justice speaker series, sponsored by the affirming committees of Claremont and Goodwood United Churches. We are absolutely thrilled to have Michael Coren with us here tonight. Our moderator, Reverend Lionel Kettelow, will be introducing him fully in a moment. But first, let me start by saying that in order to preserve bandwidth and to be less distracting for the speaker, it'd be great if we could all push stop video so that our pictures aren't showing and that we remain muted throughout. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that we are all seated on lands which remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people whose relationship with the land remains central to their lives. May we all awaken to new opportunities to walk in justice and reconciliation with the first people of Turtle Island. And if we could have a moment of prayer. Creator God, source of all that is, bless all who have gathered here tonight to listen and learn. We pray that we may be people of peace who live from a place of justice and join our voices with others who want to give birth to new ways of being in this world. Amen. And with that, I will hand it over to Lionel.
Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to our event this evening. I'm Lionel Kettelow, the minister serving at both Goodwood United Church and Claremont United Church. And I'm excited to be here tonight. And also it's a privilege for me to be introducing you, Michael, our guest, Reverend Michael Coren. So Michael is well known as a TV and broadcast personality, author, journalist, and currently a columnist for the Toronto Star and for iPolitics, I believe. And Michael is the author of a number of books, and one of his recent titles is called Epiphany, A Christian's Change of Heart and Mind Over Same-Sex Marriage, and that was published in 2016. So Michael, it is great to have you here with us this evening. And just a note for all of us this evening around process, Michael has been asked to speak for roughly 30 minutes. Michael, we won't complain if you go over. And after that time, or during the time that Michael is speaking, you're welcome to use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and enter in any questions you have. And then after Michael has spoken, Debbie and I will take turns bringing these questions to Michael. So Michael, with that introduction, it's good to have you here. And we're looking forward to what you're sharing tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My most recent book, actually, because the Epiphany one is quite old now. I didn't realize it was that long ago when you mentioned the date, golly. But the most recent one, which is absolutely brilliant, is called The Rebel Christ. And that only came out in October. And it's better than Epiphany because it's cheaper and it's in paperback. So, but that's one I'm actually very proud of because it really does, I suppose, encompass my views and beliefs on a lot of issues. Well, they're Christian beliefs, I believe. I wish in a way we didn't have to qualify the term Christian and the word Jesus and the word Christ. I think it should stand on its own. But it doesn't because, as you know, as well as I do, there is a division, there is conflict in the international Christian world. And I'll get to this a bit later, but the reality is that if you say to a lot of people, what does Christianity mean to you? They don't say, oh, love and joy and just, they don't. You know what they say, it's something very different, but we'll get to that later. I'm a journalist. I'm what is known as bivocational, which sounds much more sexy, actually, than it really is. All it means is that I'm an ordained priest in the Anglican Church, but I'm still a journalist. I was ordained a deacon 2.5 years ago, and I was what we call priested in September, I think it was, September of last year. But I'm still a journalist. I don't do much TV and radio now, occasionally, but I write a regular column for the Star, and I write for the Globe, and I write for TVO and iPolitics and Now and for the New Statesman in Britain and some others. So that's what it means to be bivocational. And I'm sitting in my home, our home, in West Toronto, and I'm sitting in the room. I won't turn the laptop around, but I'm looking at this very large television that was state of the art when I bought it a few years ago, curved screen, and now it won't even take the most modern apps. It's too old. But anyway, this is where I watch soccer on a Saturday morning. So this room has probably been witness to more bad language than you can imagine. So thank goodness there's not a football match on right now while I'm speaking to you. So that's where I'm speaking from. And we've been in this home for about 25 years. We have 4 children. 2 are married. One's engaged, the other one not. And our first, you see, if you weren't muted, this is where you'd all cheer. And our first grandchild is due any week now.
Yay!
One meager cheer. So that's our daughter Lucy, who is in Ottawa. So that's me, and I'll start off with a story of a friend of mine. It concerns faith, and a friend of mine. I'm a journalist. A lot of people I know are in media, and he's a foreign affairs specialist, and he was a correspondent in Latin America for a big British newspaper for many years. And then they moved him. He didn't ask to be moved, but they decided to move him to be the Middle East correspondent based in Jerusalem. So he went to Jerusalem. And first few days after he'd got used to the time difference and so on, and jet lag, he just spent time walking around all of the city, east and west, just talking to people. It's a very good thing for a foreign correspondent to do, rather than the politicians will come later and the military leaders and all of that will come later. Just speak to ordinary people. It's always said, if you really want to know what's going on, just get into a cab and ask the cab driver. And as the son of a London cab driver, that's true. So he walked around and he spoke to various people. And then he went to what is known as the Wailing Wall, the Kotel, the Western Wall in Jerusalem. This huge, enormous wall that was merely the prop, that the base of the temple that was destroyed in around AD 70. On top of this was the base of the temple. On top of that was everything else. But it's the only thing that is, I mean, there's much more they're uncovering, but it's the only thing of its size that's still there. And he went up to in the waiting when he was looking around and chatting to people. And there was, right up against the wall, an elderly man, almost curled up in as close to the wall as you could be. And my friend went to the man and he said to him, "Excuse me, do you speak English?" And the man said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Do you mind if I ask you, do you come here a lot?" And the man said, "I come here every single day of the week. I'm here at sunrise and I stay here until the sun goes down every day of the week." And my friend said, "That's amazing. That's wonderful. And you pray, I assume?" He said, "Yes." So what do you pray? He said, "I say the same prayer every single day, over and over again, sunrise to sundown. I say the same prayer all day, every day." "My golly," my friend said, "well, what is to pray?" He said, "Well, I pray that Jew, Muslim, and Christian will live in peace and harmony, that Israeli and Palestinian will be brothers, and that there will be peace in the Middle East." And my friend said, "I don't want to be cynical, but it hasn't actually worked out, has it?" And the man said, "Worked out? It's like talking to a brick wall." Cue laughter. Wendy's not laughing. Faith is impossible to quantify, impossible to measure, but I think it's the very epicenter of all that is great and beautiful. And the next story I'd like to tell you before I speak about other things is not a funny story. It's a true story. And I think it's about faith. This is not something that happened to me. It happened to a dear friend of mine. Well, he tells the story. And it was some years ago in the 1970s in Britain. And you have to think of the political and cultural climate back then. It wasn't, well, I suppose it was quite some time ago, really, when I think about it, but it seems like a totally different age. Homophobia was just accepted. That was a set position. Britain is an advanced progressive country, but it's still deeply homophobic at that period. And people could be gay, of course, but they were joked about and they were treated with derision. This was the era of Margaret Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, and she had passed legislation that was actually quite notoriously homophobic. And it was a miners' strike, and the country was polarized, and the police were seen as being very much not the army, but the muscle of the Prime Minister and of conservatism. It was an ugly time in many ways. Police, other parts of the population in conflict, conservative government. A young man outside of a major city, not London or Manchester or Birmingham. He was gay. He hadn't come out to his family, only to his closest friends. That was the climate. Small town. And a friend of his in the gay community said, you know what, this thing we're hearing about, you should get tested, this thing. He said, oh no, that's America, that's California, nothing to do with here. He said, well, I think you should be. We all are. This young man went to be tested, and you probably know what I'm going to say. He had AIDS. And back then, it was a death sentence. It was incredibly unusual to survive. Today, thank God, people can lead full lives, but then it was a death sentence. And it wasn't only a death sentence, it was dying alone often, and in pain, and with contempt, because if any group resembled lepers of scriptural times, it was gay men at this period. And he was terrified, and he was alone. And in despair, he got onto his motorbike one evening and he rode out as fast as he could and didn't care whether he lived or died. And he rode at great speed into a very large tree. And he thought he was dead, if you can be such a thing. And but he realized he was, when he came into consciousness, that he was still alive. And then the pain set in, and he realized what had happened, and he was bleeding profusely. The blood began as obviously he panicked, and his heart pumped, and there was blood, it seemed, everywhere, and pain, and inside his head he was screaming, and then all these lights and sirens, and then what he thought was an angel came out of the darkness. And it wasn't an angel. It was a police officer in a high visibility vest, shining orange. A police officer in Mrs. Thatcher's Britain, and a gay man lying in agony, bleeding profusely. And as the policeman approached him, he had AIDS, there was a great deal of blood. He looked up at the police officer and said, "You've got to know I have AIDS." And the police officer knelt down, cradled him in his arms and said, "And you've got to know that someone loves you." True story. And love is what we're about if we're followers of Jesus, Yeshua, the Son of God. Now, there are entire libraries of theology, and I did 3 years studying some of this at Trinity College in Toronto. And I mean, I love it and all that, but you could read theology and history of Christianity and philosophy and for years and years and years. And unless you can make that leap of faith and that journey of love, it won't really bring you that much closer to understanding Jesus, the relationship, which is what it's about. I know it's fashionable now to say this, it's relationship, not religion, but actually that's very, very true. Religion is just the cosmetics of the relationship we have with Jesus. And just recently we celebrated the birthday of Jesus. Now, I know it probably wasn't December the 25th. I mean, I realize that. Really doesn't matter at all. Doesn't matter when it happened. It matters that it happened. And I'm convinced that it did. But what are the circumstances of that? God became one of us. There was a song a few years ago, "What if God was one of us?" I won't sing it for you. You've suffered enough. But that was one of the lines, and it wasn't a Christian song, wasn't written by Christians. The thing is, God did become one of us. This is the whole point. God did become one of us. God chose at a very particular time in human history to become one of us. And this is significant because God chose the time and the place and the context. God chose to become human as the child of a teenage Jewish girl living under occupation in a powerless, anonymous part of the world. Caesar, Roman leaders didn't wake up each morning and say, "Oh, I wonder what's going on in Judea today." Couldn't care less. It was a bad posting for a soldier, a bad posting for a governor. Don't want to go there. God chose to become one of us, not as a warlord, an emperor, a king, an investment banker, God bless him, or anything else. God chose to become one of us, as I say, the son of a teenage Jewish girl living under occupation, who could have been stoned to death, by the way, for being pregnant outside of wedlock. Raised by a couple who were working class people, not living in poverty. Joseph was an artisan, could have been carpenter, we're not entirely sure, but a skilled worker. No privilege. Then as an adult, Jesus owns no property. He lives a communal existence with people who are on the fringes of society, former sex workers, former terrorist leaders, tax collectors who were despised because they were seen as collaborators, betrayers of their people. Fishermen, again, not always the caricature of the poor person. Peter may well have owned boats. His name indicates that the family spoke both Greek and Hebrew, which would have meant a certain education, but not people of privilege or power or influence. People more on the margins of society. Even Galilee, the area itself, not an area of distinction. So this is how God chose to become one of us. Chose to become one of us knowing what would happen. If we believe God is all-knowing, well, God knows what will happen. Denied by those he thought were his dearest and closest friends. Arrested, humiliated, spat at, abused, tortured, and then murdered. That is how God became one of us. And the Gospels that we have, and even the other Gospels that many of us have read, but the 4 Gospels we can rely on, the first of which was probably written AD 65, something like that. St. Paul was writing earlier, and even the last Gospel is only about AD 100, 105, 110 maybe, all written with people around who saw it at first hand and knew and understood. Those 4 Gospels are works of beauty. Not always easy. I mean, not as difficult as some of Paul's letters, not as challenging as some parts of the Hebrew scriptures, but challenging. But those Gospels are books of revolutionary love. They tell us to turn the world upside down, to start again anew They speak of love and justice and tolerance and inclusion and redistribution of wealth and power and equality and gentleness and forgiveness and compassion. Jesus is seldom angry. He is sometimes even with his own followers, the way he's responding, you can feel this, oh, come on, guys, you really still not get it. It's not anger, but it's, But when he goes to the temple and there are all of those pilgrims from the Jewish diaspora and they have to change their local currency from wherever they come from into temple coinage, and some of the people there were swindling them, or they were selling bruised animals for sacrifice. It's often money lenders. They weren't money lenders, and there's a tinge of anti-Semitism involved in that. No, it wasn't that. It was something else going on. But he shows a righteous anger. But it's very rare for that to happen. His harshest words, though, are reserved for very particular groups. For the legalistic, the rigid, the powerful, and the wealthy. There's that wonderful scene where the young man approaches Jesus and says, I keep all the commandments. And he's not being boastful. I keep the commandments. I really try. I try everything. What else must I do to follow you? And Jesus says to him, sell everything and give it to the poor. Sell everything and give it to the poor. I can almost imagine this poor guy saying, is there anyone else I could speak to? It's hard. If someone said to me, it's not that I'm wealthy, but I own a house, for goodness sake. We have 2 cars outside. I mean, they're only Toyota Corollas, but we compared to most people, sell it all, give the money to the poor. Whoa. That's what he says. And then he says, as you know, easier for a rich man, for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the gates of paradise. But of course, with God, all things are possible. It's interesting because for many years, some people said, well, of course, the eye of the needle was a gate in the walls of Jerusalem, and it was relatively small, but a camel could get in if it really quite. That's not true. That isn't true. He was using symbolism, impossible, usually. When he's speaking to those people who put the law before the love, not necessarily Pharisees. They also get a bad rap in all this. The Pharisees were often the good guys. It was the Sadducees who were the collaborators, but the thing is, the Pharisees were the main problem for the new church, this new Jewish group, this group of Jesus followers. They were the main problem because people look to the Pharisees. Ordinary people look to the Pharisees. So the Pharisees get blamed a lot. Often, I think it's incorrect. However, they could be legalistic because they were trying to keep their people together. People who'd come back from dispersion and had lost a lot of their faith. And he emphasizes to them, if you're worshiping the law, you've got it wrong. You obey certain laws because of the love. I always think to myself, our children generally, not always, but generally have been pretty well behaved. They've listened to me, not particularly, but they've listened to Dad. Because they're frightened of me? God forbid. Because of a set of laws I've written down and given to them? Because they love me. And we should be obeying, if we do, out of love. And that's what he emphasizes. That's what he stresses. It's about love. Over and over again, he says this when he's challenged by people. And of course, that wonderful scene of the woman who's caught in adultery, which people say, oh, you never have an opinion. Jesus says, it's not what he's saying. He's talking about hypocrisy and legalism. He's not saying never have an opinion. He's saying it should be an informed and righteous one. If you're without sin, cast the first stone. Don't be a hypocrite. He's turning the world upside down. What the Gospels don't talk about, though, ever, are the issues which seem to dominate the Christian narrative in so many parts of the world, particularly in the United States. And the problem is that, God bless it, the United States has such an influence culturally and politically and in so many ways that if it sneezes, the world catches a cold. And American Christianity, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, has become extremely conservative. And the conservative wing of the Roman Catholic Church has become increasingly empowered. And this has all happened since the 1960s. It wasn't like that really before. But I think it's a lot to talk about here, but I think it's a product of the civil rights movement. And I think they lost that battle. They won the wrong side and they moved into this area. And the evangelical church, for example, in the US, was not actually particularly concerned about the abortion issue. It really wasn't. If you read some of the statements coming out of the Baptist church and so on, they were fairly permissive and progressive. They changed later. But the two issues, and you know what they are, they're abortion and sexuality, in particular homosexuality. Issues that are never mentioned in the Gospels. Now, you can not mention an issue and still have an opinion on it. I understand that. But these were pretty pressing issues, and Jesus would have been challenged, but there's no account in any of the Gospels of him ever talking about it. There is one scene, though, there is one interaction that may be a reference to one of these. And I'm not saying it's absolutely certain, but I think it's worth considering. And it's when the centurion approaches Jesus, Gentile, Roman soldier, centurion, the backbone of the Roman army, oppressing, occupying. He comes up and everyone is looking, whoa, not only is this a Gentile, it's a Roman, it's a centurion, what are you doing? And he says to Jesus, I know I'm not worthy, but I have a slave, and slave doesn't mean, it had a different meaning back then. It wasn't race-based, the Romans weren't actually. One thing they weren't was racist. And if a slave served in a home, often he will become or she will become a part of the family, and the child of that slave will become a citizen. There's a strong body of thought that says that Paul's parents were actually slaves, and he was a Roman citizen because his parents were slaves and they were loved and befriended by the family. We don't really know, but it's a strong possibility. The centurion says, I love this man, and he's very ill, and I know if you just say the word, he'll be healed. And Jesus says, wow, I wish all of my people could be like this. He's healed. Now, the Greek is very interesting because, I mean, the Greek, I don't know classical Greek, but the Koine Greek that I know, there are always several words for one thing. It can be very confusing. But the word used here for love, although it's not completely romantic, it's far more than platonic. It's not the word for, I really love this guy. It's more than that. It's more than the platonic, and it's interesting, curious as to why he would have used it and why the translation would have maintained that. Plus, occupied people find ways to mock the occupiers. They don't have the power to challenge them. And one of the things that the Jewish people in the region would often do is that they would mock the Roman soldiers as being gay. And they go back to their barracks in Caesarea Maritima. You know what they get up to. So you combine this idea that Roman soldiers will mock them for being gay. Centurion says, I love him. And it's more than just platonic love. And Jesus says, it's beautiful, you're healed. He's healed. There are many scholars, I'm not a scholar, who believe that's a reference to a same-sex partnership. I'm not saying it definitely is, but it may well be. And it's the only possible reference that is made in all of the Gospels. Abortion is not mentioned at all. I think there are implications, but it's not to be the strident anti-choice position, because Jesus talks about humanity. But this notion that to be a Christian means you have to be obsessive about, to be homophobic, to be anti-choice, to get very, very angry about dying with dignity. And these are not Christian issues. Christianity is much deeper and wider and broader than that. And it understands human brokenness. It doesn't pretend it's not there. And it celebrates human beauty, celebrates relationship and love and understanding. Now, I didn't always have this position. Until about 8 years ago, you would never have invited me to speak to you. You would have locked the doors on me and I wouldn't have blamed you. I was a Christian. I wasn't raised in a Christian home, but since I think 1984, I joined the Roman Catholic Church, and I wasn't particularly conservative, but I adopted a far more rigid and conservative position over the years. And I said and wrote things that, well, they appall me now. And it wasn't that I didn't believe, it was as though I had, I don't know, spiritual myopia. The Jesus I thought I knew, that wasn't Jesus, it was something very different. And I had, if you like, an epiphany, we're in that season. Something happened. And it's very hard to explain because there was no need for it. When I changed my views, it was very interesting that people who were conservative tried to attribute my change to all sorts of sinister motives. He's had a breakdown, he's doing it for money. That always surprised me, because considering how many jobs I lost. Or the classic one of his kids is gay. Couldn't care less, frankly, but they're all boringly straight. He's gay, no. Also anything they could. There must be a reason. It couldn't just be that he had changed. There had to be a reason for it. The reason was I had something, was it supernatural that happened? I'm not going to get all spooky on you and say, oh, it was a ghost came to see me, or I had this vision. No, nothing like that. It was, I don't know. I just felt a change. I felt a profound change, and I didn't want it, and I tried to push it away, and it terrified me, and I knew it would change everything. It would make life very difficult. I was right, it did. But it was transforming, and I look back now, and I'm glad that period of transition is over, because it was very hard. But I thank God every day that it happened, because I believe it made me the Christian I should be. At the risk of sounding too pompous, I think it made me Christian. And I try in my work, both as a priest and as a journalist, to lead that life and to show others, and to live by example and witness. And I don't always get it right, but I like to think that more often than not I do. But we are all changing. We're all part of a great permanent revolution of grace and love. And the day we think we've got it right is where the day to start it all over again. That was first said to me many years ago about prayer, and it was a monk at a monastery in Britain. And we were talking about prayer. And I said to him, I think I'm getting quite a good place right now. And he said, start again. Never be frightened of starting again. Question things. Pray hard. Love harder. See God in every single person. Empathize if you possibly can. Feel what that person is feeling. Be aware. And thank God every day for becoming one of us in the way he did, and thus changing the entire world forever. Amen.
You can talk.
All right, Steve has unmuted me. Thank you so much, Michael, for what you've shared. And at this time, I'll begin with a question, but I'd invite all of us who've been listening in and participating to use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and to enter any questions that you have. And then Debbie and I will take turns bringing those questions to Michael, just to widen our conversation to include all of you. So one question that I have for you, Michael, I was thinking about people for whom their understanding understanding of Christianity is that it's a purely spiritual thing, and who would believe that, well, the church really has no place talking about politics or being involved in issues or causes, and that the church's mandate is really purely spiritual. Based on your understanding of who Christ is for you and in your ministry now as well, how would you respond to that kind of an understanding of Christianity and the church's mission based on your understanding of who you call the rebel Christ?
That's a good question. There is a vital place for those people whose Christian life consists mainly, maybe exclusively of prayer. I mentioned the monastery I used to go to, Mount St. Bernard Abbey in Leicestershire. Some of the men, they were remarkable, and there are those whose life is prayer, and thank goodness for that. And there are others who simply can't be involved politically or publicly. It's just not for them. So we must never criticize, put those people down. But passivity in the face of injustice is an anti-Christian response. So I would never tell anyone they had to be a member of any political party or vote for any party. But there are issues that we surely have to have a view about as Christians. They go beyond party politics. The future of the planet, environmental justice, indigenous rights, anti-racism, economic justice. Now, we can argue about how we achieve a society of economic justice, but we must all aspire to it. You know, I was driving to get my wife's car. That's right. It was snowed in. We were driving to get it, and and it's very eerie. It was quite beautiful yesterday morning. It's a lovely thing because people start talking to each other in this, suddenly neighbors you have never spoken to. Hi, can I help you? And we're driving along the road. It's become single lane, and there's hardly anybody around. And there's this woman with 2 shopping bags, and so I stopped the car and I said, look, where are you going? Can we give you a ride somewhere? She said, no, honestly, it's okay. She was actually much younger than I thought she was. But she said, no, it's honestly, really, it's okay. Thanks anyway. And I just thought to myself, I'm not one of the super rich, but I live in the West, but I'm driving my car to go and get my wife's car that snowed in, and then we'll both drive back in separate cars. This woman is taking public transport after 18 inches of snow have fallen, and with 2 shopping bags. There is a lack of equality that I don't think is Christian. And this is in Canada, let alone if we go to countries where they can't afford healthcare. They can't, we have people who won't take the vaccine. There are people who can't get the vaccines in part of the developing world. These are issues which we, as Christians, they should hurt us. We should feel the sting of that injustice. But it's not for everyone to be directly involved, but the church as a whole, the church as an institution, has to be involved. We can't just turn our back on this. There've been many crises in world history, and the 20th century saw a great decline of Christianity. First of all, after the First World War, because although there were non-Christian countries involved, Turkey was part of the Central Powers, and the Indian Army was enormous. I think in the First or Second War, the largest volunteer army in human history was the Indian Army. And of course, it was overwhelmingly Hindu and Sikh and Muslim. But it was really a European war, and it was Christendom ripping itself apart. And so in 1918, people said, well, this can't be right. What we've been told about Christianity and church, it's wrong. And then, of course, after 1945, when we saw the Holocaust and the slaughter, and people questioned things. Well, just take those 2 alone. If the churches really had said no, they could have changed everything. And I've read more books than I can remember about the Pope and the Holocaust and people trying to make arguments this way and that way. But if the Pope would have stood there in St. Peter's and said, you have to kill me first, it would have changed things. But he didn't do that. It wasn't as bad as some people say. It wasn't as good as some people say. But he didn't do enough. But at all of these times, these great points of historical change, the church hasn't been there. The church needs to be there. It's learned a lot of lessons, but not enough. Look, Anglican Church, United Church, Presbyterian, Lutheran. Yes, I would say often, we're pretty good on a lot of issues, but it's taken a while, and there are still many churches that aren't moving in that direction. So it's not being political, it's being Christian. And to be Christian means that if you see something that's wrong, you have to oppose it. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I think this really ties in as well with, in the beginning of your remarks, you talked about the significance of incarnation and God being born into this reality and into this world. And what does it mean for us to incarnate that love as well, eh?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Why don't we put Debbie on the screen as well, and we'll let Debbie take the next question from our...
Sure. Yeah. A question that I have for you would be, I guess what I'm asking is, are you saying we need to be more vocal? We need to be more activists. We need to be more in the thick of the issues that surround us, and that we could have something to say about? Because I know that for myself, when we talk amongst ourselves, we absolutely will say what you're saying. But there is a gap between what we're saying or what we're talking about or reading about and then action. It's sort of got to go to that next step, because it just strikes me that, so for example, the United Church of Canada is pretty quiet about a lot of things. The Anglican Church of Canada is pretty quiet about a lot of things. So you're saying we need to not be so quiet. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I am, but I would say this. One of the criticisms that is made about mainstream liberal Protestant denominations, and the Anglican Church is, many Anglicans would say, no, we're not Protestant. Well, we are. We're a product of the Reformation. But many of the criticisms, you're too political. You don't talk about the gospel enough. Well, I think that's a misunderstanding of the gospel. But Jesus comes first. And one of my criticisms is that I think we're often embarrassed about speaking about our faith. And that doesn't mean going on a street corner and saying, do you know Jesus? That's not a way to convert anybody. But we must never be, as we're told, ashamed of the gospel. So, but the way to present the gospel often is by standing up for justice. I'm just me. I know how pathetic I am in so many ways, but because I have a certain following on social media and so on, I have all these people writing to me saying, oh, golly, if you were the priest at my church, I'd be there every Sunday. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. But what they're trying to say is, you seem different. I'm not different. Actually, most Anglican clergy are pretty much like me in my views, I would say. But I have that platform. And we haven't done enough to show what Christian love, Christianity really means. So we've got to do that, I think, more efficiently. But yes, on the issues, in the UK, it's very interesting, because I'm bicultural in that, although I've been in this country most of my life, I've been married for 34 years. That's why I married a Canadian. And, but Britain has that pull on me. And I look to both countries. I'm very privileged in that way. But while there's probably more religiosity in Canada than in the UK, the Church of England in particular does have a certain position. I think it's because it's the established church. Don't be too convinced by that, because people aren't going to church very often, and the Church of England's in quite a lot of trouble. But there are half a dozen Anglican clergy in the UK who are on TV a lot, and on radio a lot, in the papers a lot. And we don't really have that. My God, it's beyond myself. There aren't many others, and we've been very reluctant to put our heads up, to say a few things. What I would emphasize is that every time we do speak out, we've got to make it clear we're saying this because of the gospel, because of Jesus. Otherwise, we just become another version of whatever, the NDP, which is no disrespect to the NDP, but we're not a political party. We should be the living institutional manifestation of Jesus. So that has to come first. And if it does, it grounds us in what we believe, and it will seem different to people when they hear us and see us when we do speak out about these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then there would be the other voice, as opposed to the evangelicals in the United States have a very large voice, and we need to counter that voice.
It's what I referred to briefly in what I said. they dominate, and there are many progressive churches in the US. Well, there are many progressive evangelicals, Black evangelicals. If you look at many of the Black liberation movements and Black progressive movements in the United States, a lot of the time, possibly even most of the time, but certainly a lot of the time, you'll see the word reverend before the name of someone. The churches are, they're central to the struggle for Black equality. They're obviously not conservative, but white evangelicals, yes, 80% voted for Donald Trump, and that number hasn't changed very much. And they have this enormous influence over the Republican Party, thus on American politics and United States itself. And here's an irony: it says we have separation of church and state. It doesn't. It's there's less separation in the US than in Canada or the UK or most of Europe. And it may not be explicit, but it's there. And I don't think an atheist could be elected president. I don't think it could happen. But enough people would say, what, we can't elect you? Well, it could in most countries in the world, as it should be. Whatever, it's up to that person, up to the electorate. And that a lot of that is this idea that America is exceptionalism. It's a country that's chosen by God. Well, no, America is full of the good and the bad, the great and the not so great, just as any other country,
Michael, another question we have from one of our participants tonight. It's a question, and I'll just read it. I think many Christians are struggling with how we live together with compassion and in the midst of the division around the COVID measures. And sorry, I'm just trying to read this here. What might the rebel Christ advise?
Well, I can't speak for the rebel Christ, but this is an issue I feel strongly about. I don't think this is an issue of informed disagreement. All of the world, the Pope spoke eloquently about this. Vaccinations, it's not just about us, it's about protecting others, particularly the elderly and the vulnerable. And the consensus of scientific knowledge and wisdom and medical research, we need to be vaccinated. Mask wearing does help. And so I've been in enough ICU wards in the past year. I've taken 12 funerals in last year, 12 funerals. And I wish people could see what it's really like before they so blithely say, a mask doesn't matter, we don't need to be vaccinated. They don't get it. So I would say, and I don't know, some people will be upset at this, but I think it's our Christian duty to be vaccinated. And I think it's our Christian duty to wear a mask. And I completely reject this fundamentalist idea that it's the mark of the beast, or we're being monitored, or it's about world population control, or people in the pay of this one or that one. No, it's not true. I don't know how COVID started. It may well be there was a lab issue. It could have, that I don't know, but it's not about conspiracy now. It's about trying to save human lives. And so it's a difficult one. There are many areas where we just have to say, well, we disagree on that. The great G.K. Chesterton, British writer, was sitting next, he was a Roman Catholic, and he was sitting next to the Archbishop of Canterbury, allegedly, this may be apocryphal, at a dinner, and they were disagreeing about certain issues. And finally, Chesterton said, in the end, let's not argue. You go on worshiping God in your way, and I'll go on worshiping God in his way. And but on that one, that's one where I would say, I'm sorry. I really do think there's only one genuinely Christian way forward on this. I really do. And I think it's a great example of communal love and empathy and sacrifice. And my diocese of Niagara, we closed the churches again just before Christmas Eve. And to be purely crass about it, financially, that will be, as you know, a great loss. A lot of people come to Christmas Mass. We were having 4 services at my church who aren't always there, who aren't usually there, and they give money. So not that that's an issue, I realize that, but it's something. And the diocese took a decision. You know what? The health of our people, of all people, matters much more than this. And it's difficult. And I hate preaching wearing a mask, and I hate the fact that I can't be part of a full church. And but we are facing an international crisis.
Lionel, I'm not seeing the chat. For some reason, my computer isn't showing it.
Okay. Is there
Oh, you
something
can't
can
click
do,
on the
Steve?
chat at the bottom of your screen?
I did that and it's up, but I'm not seeing questions. There's nothing on it. On
The
mine.
last
well,
one
that's-
mine stops at 8:07.
Is there
Okay.
a question there, Lionel?
Maybe there are no more questions.
Okay.
Oh, no, there is one. There's someone who's Jen Brown, and she says, can I ask a question verbally, please? Thank you.
Oh, Jen. Oh, yeah, there you are. Yeah, Jen. Hi.
Hi, Stephen. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome.
Oh, and hi, Lionel as well. I went to school with Stephen, so I'm just finishing up a student ministry placement, and hopefully final interview, and will be recognized this coming spring. So it's pretty exciting.
Fingers
But
crossed.
thank you. I'm serving a 2-point pastoral charge, a rural pastoral charge, and so what you talked about tonight, this whole thing about love and coming from a place of love, and that it's this radical love, is something that I've really was fairly new for me as a student. And I'm sure if you spoke to Stephen, I grew up Catholic. So, steeped in like very rigid, traditional, God is he and all of that. But I'm trying to shift the thinking of my charge of coming from a place of love. And I've tried to do little things to connect us to the national church's justice initiatives. So like acknowledging the land as something simple, even just talking about racism in general. But my question to you, Michael, is what advice would you give to someone who is a leader or has either a minister or has a leadership role in either rural or urban congregations who are met with resistance to wanting to love those people that are on the fringe, or who disconnect and say, well, that's not in our place. We don't need to worry about that because that doesn't happen here.
Okay. Well, I mean, I have no experience of rural ministry, just to tell you that. I know what you meant about being raised Catholic, but, there are countless wonderful, beautiful people in the Catholic Church doing marvelous work. And I know what you mean, though. I was in the Catholic Church for a long time, but there are. I work in a suburban ministry, I suppose, because my church is in Burlington. And I have to say, it's been 2.5 years now, and I thought I'd be charging forward to talk about scripture, and a lot of the work I do is just sitting with people as they cry and trying to be some company to people who don't have much company. I've probably spoken more about Downton Abbey than the Bible. A lot of that. You have to meet people where they are. You know this. You can probably teach me this. But there's a glorious banality, and that sounds pejorative, but there's a glorious banality. The extraordinary within the ordinary of what it means to really do the job, clerical work. I don't like meetings. I find there are too many of those, but they're probably important. But really, a lot of what I do, long conversations on the phone, sometimes going over things that you've already spoken about, but just listening and being there. One of the great horrors of contemporary life is loneliness. And we deal often with older people, and they've lost partners sometimes, and there's a lot of that, and that can be agony. Assisted living centers and retirement homes, even when they're lovely, it's still very difficult. I take a lot of services there, and I'll take the services sometimes and I'll wonder if anyone sitting there is actually even aware I'm there. But we never know. So now when it comes to preaching, it's different. And I think you can say some important things. And does that mean you'll get in trouble with your superiors? It might be. It might. I mean, you might. If you're getting pushback, and if you want to reach out to people, I mean, everybody has to be held and loved. But there are those people who maybe do not have a roof over their head or struggling with addiction or whatever. If you really want to reach out to those people, it will be deeply sad, even shocking, if someone in authority said to you that you shouldn't be doing that. Because I think it's wonderful that you want to, and we should be, not to the exclusion of others. You know, that does happen sometimes. There are people who think, well, it's only those people who we should, no, we have to be there for all people. And I've been in homes that are obviously quite wealthy, but the people in them, well, they may have material comforts, but they're in agony. So again, but I'm going to recommend a TV show to you. And it's on BritBox, which I think it's on BritBox, which is very good. It's only about $10 a month, and I think it's really good value. And you may have seen the show. The show is called Rev, R-E-V. Now, I can't see everyone, so I'm not sure if they're saying, yes, that's great. But the show is called Rev. Now, you'll be fine with it. There may be some people in the Christian world who will be appalled. It's not pornographic or anything, but it's real. It's about a Church of England priest in a part of London I know extremely well, where North and East London meet, probably sort of Hackney area. And it's a dying church, really. And it's Tom Hollander, you may recognize. And there are some wonderful cameo appearances, Liam Neeson, Ralph Fiennes, Olivia Colman, before she was famous and won the Oscar. Well, she was fairly famous. She plays his wife. It's the most authentic, accurate depiction of the life, certainly of a Church of England, of an Anglican priest I've ever seen. And the advisors on it, I know one of them quite well, were clergy. And it's about dealing with people, often on the fringes, and the reality of being a cleric and the pastoral work you do, and the temptations and the pain and the frustrations and so on. So I'd recommend that, actually. And if you have any problems finding it, email. In fact, all of you, if you want to email me at any point, I only have one email, and it's mcoren@simpatico.ca. mcoren@simpatico.ca. There's no one else there, just me. My dad, God rest his soul, many, many years ago would leave messages on my answering machine saying, could you tell him that his dad called? Dad, it's me. There's no one else here. But I mean, I don't think I've given you much of an answer, but anyway, that's where there's also a book I'd recommend, as well as my own book, obviously, but I shouldn't be promoting other people's. There's a book called Fathomless Riches. Fathomless Riches. And it's by a man called Richard Coles, C-O-L-E-S. You may not have heard of him. If you were a Brit, you would have heard of him, because he's all over the place these days. Now, he's just retiring, but he's a Church of England priest. And he's the only Church of England priest to have had a #1 record in the charts. He was in Bronski Beat. Some of you weren't even born when these bands were. Bronski Beat and the Communards, and he was in both. And the Communards were #1 for a large part of the year in the early 80s with Don't Leave Me This Way. Anyway, this is the first part of his autobiography, and it takes him up to ordination. How this gay man on the left on the political left, pretty much, who was in a cutting edge band in the 70s and early 80s, who lived through the AIDS crisis, becomes a Christian and eventually a priest. And I think it's the most wonderful account I've ever read of conversion. The first half of it isn't, well, the first third of it certainly isn't about that at all. It's about being a pop star and drugs and all sorts of things. But then you see this drifting into faith. And there's a wonderful little bit of it I remember when he's telling a friend from, the group of people he's with, I mean, media, gay community. I mean, this is not a natural place for Christian conversion. And he says to his friend, I'm going back to university. And the guy says, oh, what are you going to study? And this is how it goes. He said, theology, geology, theology, geology, theology, geology. He cannot comprehend what Richard is saying. Anyway, 2 recommendations for you.
Thanks, Jen.
And good luck, Jen. Good luck.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks.
So I have managed to see it now. It came up eventually. So another question, there's 2 questions from one person. And so the first part of it is, so can you tell us the end of the story of the man with AIDS who was in an accident and the policeman said, you've got to know that someone loves you.
Well, I hate to be really disappointed. And actually that story is Richard Coles, who I just mentioned. He writes about that. And Richard's a friend, has been a big influence on my life, more than he knows, in fact. This is going to sound dreadful. I don't have one. He died later, not from his injuries. But, I'm not going to say to you, and he gave his life to Jesus. And it's really just an example of love. And I don't even know who the police officer was. It sounds to me like the cop probably was a Christian, but I don't know. But it was just a situation where 2 people from such different backgrounds, when there should have been hostility, something greater happens. And this was a time when if someone had AIDS, that they weren't even touched. That's why Princess Diana was so transforming when she hugged that man in the hospital, because people just didn't do that.
Thank you. And the second part of her question is, she said, you've mentioned that Christians have an obligation to do something about the inequities in our world. What would you suggest would be a place to start?
Well, it's up to you. I mean, and your particular circumstances. Some Christians can be a bit hardline on this, and it's not about charity. It's about systemic change. Well, it is about systemic change, but it's also about charity. And the church I'm with at the moment, they have they do so much work with people who need clothing and need food, and it's marvelous what they do, and I admire them so very much. And yes, it will be tremendous if our system changed where nobody was hungry, but I don't think we're going to achieve that in my lifetime. And whatever you think you can do. If for you, there are a number of politicians who don't speak about their faith very often, but I happen to know are Christian, and they're actually motivated by their faith. And that maybe that's for you, some sort of public office. Maybe it's just as an activist campaigning to get things changed. But if for you, it is being there for people who need to be visited, helping make meals so that people can be fed, helping to give advice. And that, I think, just being on the right side. But no, we change the world in small ways. There are these great people who, I've got, in the smallest room in the house, I'll be euphemistic here, I have all these dictionaries, 19th century, 18th century, because I've got to be very, sometimes maybe you want to browse as you're sitting. And so I do that quite a lot, giving it too much away. And there's all these great people, there's a big entry on that famous person and that famous person. And it's true. And a lot of them did wonderful work and really were on the right side of history, not all. But those people who are anonymous, who we'll never know about, there's a story. Oh golly, I seem to be quoting Richard Coles all the time. This is in, I think, the second book that Richard wrote. And it's when he is a priest in a town in the English Midlands that I always thought was a quite ordinary town, but apparently there's a lot of poverty there. And he said the council estate, that subsidized housing, was some of the worst conditions he's ever seen in his life. And it was very bad, very rough. And he took a number of funerals in the community, and it became a bit perfunctory because he didn't know them, you know, and so he was just speaking in the best way he could, most compassionate way, but didn't really know anyone. And usually there was no one there. And he took a funeral one day, and he realized there are quite a lot of people here. And then there were more people, and it was crowded with people, and he couldn't work this out. The woman whose funeral it was lived in this little house with him. So he did the funeral, and he noticed a good-looking young biracial guy wearing an army officer's uniform, not an enlisted man, an officer's uniform. And he said to him, "Excuse me, do you mind if I chat to you?" And the guy said, "Yeah, sure." And Richard said, "Who was she?" And the guy said, "Well, pretty much everyone here, she saved their lives." And he said, "Me, I would have been dead, in prison, gang. Conditions are rough. She would take us in. She'd make sure we were fed properly. She'd make us go to school. She saved our lives." No one knew. He didn't know. So there are all sorts of people who change the world in ways that won't be recorded, but that are nevertheless world-changing.
Thank you. I'm noticing that we're running a little bit over time, but we do have one more question. I don't know.
What would you like? I'm here. I'm in a comfy chair. No problem.
Okay. So, did you want to do that one? Let's see. It says, okay. Question is, how do you think the rebel Jesus would feel about the National Indigenous Anglican Church and using First People tradition in church?
I don't know anything about it, I'm afraid. And as a non-Indigenous person, I'm not sure. It's an issue I knew nothing about before I came to Canada, obviously. I came from the UK. And it seems to me the Anglican Church has done quite well. I mean, as with you, we read a land acknowledgement at each service, and it's not perfunctory. It's fairly long, and we take it seriously, and we do a lot of work with, and we try to listen to. But beyond that, I don't really know enough about the church structure to give an informed answer. I'm sorry. Wish I could say more on that.
Thank you. And I do want to give a really big thank you to you for being with us here tonight.
Pleasure.
For reminding us so eloquently about the revolutionary love of Jesus that we as his followers need to emulate, or try to be like, and be part of that revolution of love. Take it back to the origins and back to where it began, and which was so earth-changing. I mean, there was this one little baby, and all these thousands of years later, we're still celebrating that amazing revolutionary person who was God's son. So, and reminding us that religion is really just about the cosmetics. It's really more about relationship and how we show up. So I want to thank you so much for coming and speaking with us tonight, sharing your wisdom and your humor and your experiences. It's been grand. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. And I mean it about the email. If there's anything I can do, please email me. I always get back. I feel quite strongly about that. I get very upset with people who don't return emails, and there are a number of them. So I do, and just remind me, where we met and so on. And if there's anything I can do for anyone, I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
very much, Michael.
Have a great rest of the evening.
All right. God bless everyone. Bye-bye. Do pray for me.